Hello, dear friends, and happy World Constitution Day. My name is Kostas Chrysogonos, and I am a professor of constitutional law at the University of Thessaloniki, Greece. I would like to argue that formal constitutions are essentially civil peace agreements. What should that mean? Constitutionalism has emerged in close association with the state. Yet the state has preceded the era of formal constitutions by several millennia, and it was from its very beginnings closely connected to the phenomenon of violence. Since it claims to monopolize violence in its territory by prohibiting its use by private individuals. The outward use of the armed power of the state is historically frequent in conflicts with other states or even with pre-state social formations. From the emergence of early states at about the third millennium before current age until the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 current age, war was by and large the rule and peace the exception for most states. This had lasting effects on the institutional profile of the state. If the latter is belligerent most of the time, its policies are foremost an attempt to manage the consequences of one or another outcome of military operations. Worse still, during war, decisions of the military leadership tend to be invested with the cloak of necessity and imposed de facto on the political leaderships. If the belligerent situation tends to become permanent, the organization of the state also tends to become combatant. The maxim, "Now we fight for everything we have got," which was the anthem sung by ancient Greeks during the Battle of Salamis in 480 before current age, easily mutates into "now the fight is above everything else," and that mutates into "now and always the commander-in-chief is above anybody else." The function of the warlord thus absorbs that of the head of the state, and overall the hierarchical logic of the military infiltrates the polity. It is not a coincidence that war is named as a reason for the temporary suspension of the conduct of elections and of the exercise of certain civil rights in many constitutions worldwide. In contrast to that, pacification typically facilitates the enactment of a constitution or the implementation of an existing one. The core principle of constitutionalism is that consent, expressed mainly through the election by voting of those persons called upon to exercise political power, becomes the fundamental organizational principle of the polity. From about the last quarter of the 18th century up to the last quarter of the 20th century, hierarchical principles of political organization have gradually receded all over the planet Earth. Most of the existing national states possess now formal constitutions. The aforementioned historical developments are interconnected with the evolution of global political geography. The phenomenon of violent border changes was drastically reduced after the decolonization of the 20th century. Global death rates in violent political conflicts oscillated during 5.5 centuries up to the end of the Second World War and were sharply reduced after it. In tandem with this relative pacification, nowadays a formal constitution stands at the top of the national legal order of most countries. Of course, the spread of formal constitutions is a multidimensional phenomenon caused by the concurrence of a series of interconnected factors. Among those, special mention could be made to the Industrial Revolution, which led to an unprecedented economic, and demographic growth on a global scale, and therefore necessarily to the ascendance of human societies to higher levels of complexity and thus of symbolization as well. As far as the political system is concerned, symbolization is being elevated from the level of customary rules to that of formal constitutions printed on paper, which express the institutionalized confidence of citizens into the terms of pacification of a society on a deliberative/consensual basis. The intrinsic aim of a formal constitution is to contribute to the pacification of a given human society, and its ultimate measure of success is the degree of this contribution. By providing a stable framework for the planned and peaceful resolution of social and political disputes, the Constitution claims to prevent these disputes from escalating to the point of violent conflict on a mass scale, and thus to preserve the political unity of the society. It should, however, be noted that a constitution is neither the one and only, nor even the most important factor contributing towards the preservation of that unity. The main foundations of the latter are rather of a social and economic nature, whereas cultural parameters such as collective identities related to ethnicity, religion, and history may be critical as well. When such centripetal factors do exist and function alongside it, a formal constitution typically facilitates political unification based on deliberation and voting instead of force. Indeed, it could be argued that a formal constitution is a sort of a civil peace agreement between the various political and social forces or groups of a given human society, insofar as its drafting procedure was inclusive, or as far as those forces or groups have ex post facto accepted the roadmap for political decision making set forth by the Constitution, by participating in elections or cabinets. It goes without saying that reaching agreements is no easy task, since various cleavages exist in human societies. Therefore, constitution making typically entails compromises of various kinds between social and political forces based on the balance of power between them, without any a priori guarantee of fairness. In sum, internal pacification on the basis of agreement following deliberation, compromise, and voting belongs to the inner logic of constitutionalism. The spread of formal constitutions on a global scale is closely associated with the fact that armed conflict between national states has receded, and that even within each state, or at least in many of them, socioeconomic and cultural dynamics more conducive to a peaceful resolution of political disputes have emerged. Vice versa, normative constitutions typically aim to contribute to a further internal pacification of a given human society, and their ultimate measure of success is the degree of their contribution towards that end. Thank you very much for listening.